Hey everybody, thanks for having us. If I don't know you already, just a quick little background of the New England Food System Planners Partnership. We are a collaboration amongst 7 state-level food organizations, including the Maine Food Convergence Project and the Maine Network of Community Food Councils, 6 state agricultural, economic, and development representatives, um, including Maine DACF and Food Solutions New England, which, as many of you know, is a regional network that unites the food system community. And our work really centers on mobilizing our networks to impact the local and regional food supply chain so that we can strengthen and grow the New England regional food system. And our primary project is New England Feeding New England, which is a 10-year initiative to have 30% of the food produced in New England consumed in New England in 2030 by 2030. And Tanya Swain is going to lead us through some slides talking about our primary initiative as a result of presenting that 30 by 30 goal, which is called our Local Food Counts Project, which we conducted last year into 2024 and published reporting and a data dashboard on, and talking to you all about what we're doing for our next local food count, which we will repeat in 2026 and in 2031, looking at 2025 data and 2030 data, really just to measure, using it as a tool to measure what our local and regional consumption is here in New England. So Tanya, I will hand it off to you.
Thanks, Leah. Hi, everyone. I'm Tanya Swain. I, until pretty recently, worked with the Maine Food Strategy Initiative and was involved with the Food Convergence and the New England Food System Planners Partnership. And towards the end of my tenure at Maine Food Strategy, I helped coordinate the Maine Local Food Count study with Leah and with a couple of researchers. Some of you may know Chelsea Marshall and Bree Bowman, who did a lot of the heavy lifting, doing some outreach to businesses. So today, I think, as Leah kind of mentioned, I'll be sharing some high-level findings from the local food count study that was just completed. I'll be introducing a new data dashboard that the partnership has put together and talking about some ways you can use it in your work. And we'll talk a little bit about next steps and how folks on the call might support the next local food count study that's being planned for 2026. Next slide, please. So to remind everyone on the call, if you're not familiar with the partnership or the New England Feeding New England project, the partnership and New England Feeding New England, which I'll call the NEFNI project on this call, is promoting a goal of seeing 30% of the food produced in New England consumed in New England by 2030. One of the primary purposes of the NEFNI project is to support strengthening local and regional food supply chains. And as everyone on this call, I'm sure knows, food systems are connected to the environment, our communities, and the economy. The NEFNI report, which was published earlier actually in June, I think 2023, we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. It looks at the 30% by 2030 goal from these angles, and it tries to answer, why is the goal important, and can New England reach this goal by 2030? Next slide, please. So the NEFNI report came out in June 2023, lots and lots of data and information in the report. This, I think, was shared with this group already. It's a foundational piece of research that looks at a regional approach to food system resilience. So we're going to talk in a minute a little bit about this new data dashboard that features some of the information from the report and was created to help illustrate the findings and reflect data in a way that's more accessible. Next slide, please. This is a snapshot of the data dashboard. This is on the partnership's website, and I see that Alita put that into the chat a minute ago, and you guys can all probably pull that up while I'm talking if you'd like. Each of the 5 bubbles that you see on this screenshot corresponds to the 5 main sections of the NEFNI report. The last bubble corresponds to the 2022 local food count. Each of these contains multiple graphics that you can click through, follow the arrows on the side of each graphic to do this, and then each also has subpages. The 2017 Ag Census data analyzed for the NEFNI report has also been updated on the dashboard with 2022 Ag Census data. The information that's now available through the dashboard can be exported. It can be used in grant reporting, also in grant writing, can be used to inform policy and for folks to develop strategies that support local and regional food supply chains. One intent of the dashboard is to make the data from the NEFNI report more accessible. It's easier to see trends when you look at some of the graphics and to see information that's presented in some of the different types of graphs and visual illustrations. And any of the information on here can be downloaded. You can create JPEGs. So the intent again is to really make it user-friendly and in a form that people can pull from it. And I hope everybody gets a chance to dig into it. Lots of information here. Next slide, please. Thanks, Leah. Also reminding everybody on the call today that in conjunction with the reports, the big NEFNI reports, state briefs were released in the fall of 2023 that looked at some of the data specific to each of the New England states. And just kind of a mention that the project is a collaborative effort by the respective state agency partners. Department of Ag in Maine was involved for Maine, and the New England State Food System Planners Partnership. And in Maine, our sort of state organization counterpart at the time was Maine Food Strategy, Maine Food Convergence, and the Maine Network of Food Councils are now sitting at that table. Next slide, please. So now I want to segue to the focus of today's presentation, which is the inaugural 2022 local food count, which took place regionally in 5 states, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Maine. And the purpose of the study, again, was to look at sales and purchases of locally produced foods within each New England state and the region. The study leaned on methodology that Vermont developed and has used in, I think it's 4 local food count studies that have been administered since 2011. And results from the 2022 study were added to volume 4 of the NEFNI report, Understanding Market Channels and Food Expenditures, that was and were released on September 10th this year. Next slide, please. Thanks. This is a snapshot of the organizations that were involved in the study. Research leads, associates, and State Department funders are partners, with funding that was made possible by several partners, including the Kendall Foundation, and in Maine, Focus Maine provided funding for our researchers. I was going to flip to, I think, a link to one of the to the dashboard, but I think I'm going to wait and just keep going through the slides at this point. Or Leah, you're going to pull it up? I think for time's sake, we're going to touch on it later. So I'm just going to,
okay. Yeah,
that makes sense. Okay, so the next slide brings us to Maine and the 2022 Maine local food count data. And we're going to be talking a little bit about what it tells us. And the first question is really, why does choosing local food matter? And this is part of the reason to be collecting this data. By purchasing food and beverages from local regional farmers and fishers, aquaculturists, processors, manufacturers, the full range of folks that are involved in our local food system. We're investing in local businesses and communities and building an insurance policy against food supply chain risks. Local and regional food can also be healthier, fresher, and more culturally appropriate. The local food count study starts to establish baseline data for how much of the food dollars spent in Maine are being spent on locally grown, harvested fish or processed foods. And understanding this information will help us understand whether the region is moving towards the 30% by 2030 goal. A call to increase regional food spending must be met, and this is something the partnership is really clear on: increase regional food production, and also recognizing that food systems have a long history of systemic racism and discriminatory practices that need to be changed, both in terms of who is able to produce and to buy locally produced foods. The work of the partnership is premised on the expectation that everyone in Maine and New England, regardless of income, race, ethnicity, gender, location, citizenship status, language spoken, or physical ability, should be able to enjoy healthy local food from trusted sources. Food security can and should be achieved for everyone who lives in New England, and it's going to be critical to leverage cross-sector coalitions to stimulate systemic solutions to food access and security if we're going to reach the 30% by 2030 goal. And the food processing work group is a great example of this kind of cross-sector collaboration. Next slide, Leah. So this is confusing and hard to understand. So I'm going to try to explain this as best as I can. But what I guess I would encourage folks to do is if you have questions or you need more details on how the calculations in the report were made, be great to probably connect with Leah on how to dig into that a little bit more deeply. So on this slide, you see a couple of steps. This is like the most basic overview of how calculations were made for the report. Step one was that researchers found the numerator. They were estimating local food spending. And how this was gathered was the research team for Maine and for each of the states actually, but for Maine specifically spent about December of last year to February building out a contact database with entities in state that purchase or sell food. And this included contacts at assisted living facilities, correctional facilities, distributors, schools and institutions, grocers, sort of the full range of folks that might be involved in selling or purchasing food. And then our regional analyst, and this is a gentleman named Scott Richardson, who was the lead data analyst and did the work sort of figuring this stuff out, or led it at any rate, built a comprehensive list for supermarket chains, cross-state distributors, and food service management companies that cross state lines. So really looking at those companies that are operating regionally that both purchase and sell food. And then in order to accurately assess the prevalence of local food spending within the region, researchers collected state level data using a shared definition of what constitutes local across different food types. So this generally meant food that was grown, harvested, manufactured in Maine or New England. So that was the framework that we were using when we were asking people for their data on what they were doing for sales or purchases. And then an electronic survey was created and administered between March and May 2024 that went out to these businesses and institutions and organizations that sell food to ask them about their 2022 food purchasing. So that was the first number, looking at the numerator that was an estimate of local food spending. And then the second major part of the calculation was trying to figure out total food spending. I'm stumbling over myself, keeping all of this straight. So then we'll talk about this a little bit more, but despite robust outreach and follow-up efforts from our state research associates, the survey response rates were pretty low. And so the responses were non-representative for the largest food sourcing sectors. And some of the respondents provided questionable data or cursory estimates that weren't totally clear as to what was going on. So the data we received was used to inform local percentages that were applied to state spending by market channel to estimate total spending. But some of the information that also informed this came from some data that USDA has. So USDA has data in its food expenditure series that estimates New England's percent of national food spending at home and away from home. Using total food spend. I'm now stumbling over my notes, but at any rate, some of this USDA data from the food expenditure series was used to inform these numbers, as well as a data set on state food sales without taxes and tips. And this is data for all purchasers. that was used to help calculate each state's and New England's percentage of total US spending on food at home or food away from home. So those two numbers were part of the calculations to try to figure out what's the percentage of all the food that's being spent on local food, both in each state and in the region. And then in addition to that, the data analysts looked at market channels. So they tried to create estimates for each state's local food spending in different market channels, for example, grocery stores or colleges and universities. Leah, do you feel like I'm getting this right, or is there anything you would
Yeah,
add to clarify?
I thought that was really good. Yep.
Sorry to be stumbling, but it is complicated. So generally, this is how the calculations were made. And now I'm going to look a little bit about what they found. So the next slide, I'm going to show you a couple of graphs. The first graph that you can see here is the estimate of total and local food spending in Maine in 2022, which was 12.8 billion. And this was derived from the USDA, some of the USDA data I just mentioned. So of that total food spending, researchers estimate that 432 million was spent regionally on regionally sourced products, or about 3.4%. So basically what this is saying is, of the food spending that happened in Maine in the year 2022, about 3.4% of those dollars were spent on products that were fished or farmed or processed in Maine. Okay, the next slide. So the next slide that we're looking at breaks this down further by market channel type. And here it estimates that $291 million of the $432 million that was for food and alcohol purchase for at-home consumption, and another $141 million for food and alcohol that was spent away from home. So this is, I'm pulling this up bigger on my screen so that I can see it myself better here. So this is looking at, in Maine, the amount of food or the dollars that were spent on food away from home and food at home. Leah, anything you'd add to that slide before we move on from it?
No, I think it can be confusing to toggle between these and explain. They sort of like build off of each other, so it's not really possible to like look at one and understand the full picture. But like as Tanya said, this main total here is the 12.8 billion that we derived from the USDA Food Expenditure Series data. And then we are estimating that 432 million of that was spent on regionally sourced food products. So the main number is 3.4%. And then if you look at this is basically that total 432 million is just broken down by those two categories that Tanya explained, which again is how the food expenditure series data is quantified in the food away from home and food at home. So that's how we had to basically build out our data set after many months of trying to wanting to get data by product category. We had to go to this other data set to inform how we actually reported on the data so that we could layer it appropriately.
And just to clarify, Leah, when we're talking about food away from home, we're talking about like restaurants,
Yes.
places where people are buying prepared food.
Yeah, maybe what you, if heaven forbid, you have to be at a hospital, what you might consume at the hospital. We know that, 20,000, there's 20,000 something servings per day that's commonly consumed at any institution based on people coming and going. And so food away from home is anything that's purchased outside of the home. And then obviously food at home is what we cook at home, et cetera. But there are more comprehensive explanations and descriptions of those in the actual local food count reporting itself. So you can really see the breakdown there.
And just to quickly just go back to that other slide one more time, just because I know it's hard for people to look at this and kind of get your head around it, right? So if you guys are looking at this graph, so the little strip of purple at the top of each of these bars, right? That's the amount of food that is local. Okay, so if you're looking at food away from home, the first bar, you can see that about 2.4% of the spending that was on food from away from home was on local food. And when people are eating at home, so this would be like food that they're purchasing at a grocery store to prepare at home, about 4.2% of that type of food was spent on purchases of local food.
Tanya and Leah, I wonder if you can shut me down, but if we take a pause and just see if people have any reflections or questions, because it's a lot of information and
I think that's a great idea, and I just want to give people time to just look at these because it's a lot to try to absorb and get your head around.
I see Bill raised his hand too. Bill, you want to?
Yeah, you mentioned somewhere in there, Tanya, you said food, then food and beverage. So is this a food and beverage number?
Yes.
So I'm hoping somewhere you've been able to divide that out because it's going to be extremely skewed when it comes to beverage. And I'm thinking beer and alcohol.
Alcohol is separate. Alcohol is separate in the food expenditure series data from other beverages.
How about beer? Oh, is that including beer?
Yes.
Okay. So so the numbers I'm looking at don't are just uh, what produce, fish.
So it's not broken out from this number because this
Oh,
is
okay,
total
okay,
food spend.
So
But when,
this is from the USDA data, correct, Leah?
yes. So I can pull up the while we get to other questions, Bill, I can pull up the details that we were able to get when we were actually uh trying to understand the local
right,
number in Maine. We had wanted in the beginning of this project, we operated off the most current version of what Vermont had used as its methodology, and Vermont has been doing this for 10 years.
right,
So they're able to get very detailed product category data, which we were not able to
right.
get. So you can see here in beverages excludes, so this food and beverage number is comprehensive of both alcoholic beverages and non-alcoholic beverages
Mm,
in this total that you're looking at.
okay,
But it's not in this graph itself, it's not broken down by product category.
got it. All right. I think that's important to understand too because
Yes, yep.
yeah. Okay, great. Thank you.
Mhm.
And Alita, not Alita, Susan, I see your hand, but also Alita has a clarifying question.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Alita.
yeah, thanks. I think I may have missed this, but in this case, is local referring to food grown, caught, sourced, processed, whatever in New England, or is this broken out by Maine specifically?
So let me pull up real quick our don't look at my Google Drive, it's scary. The local food count page that we have our definitions on. What we had set out to do was have local mean Maine and
Hmm.
regional mean New England. However, it wasn't that simple, given the data that we were able to procure. So if you look in the actual local food count reporting, there is a entire page dedicated to the categories and definitions that we used, which again is built off of Vermont's. But what we did was we had to change and modify the language a little bit. So for example, and based on product category, that changes, right? Seafood's a good example of that. So seafood and seafood products were quantified as meeting this universal criteria, which was that any animal protein product composed of finfish, shellfish, or mollusks, i.e., haddock, smoked salmon, canned tuna, live lobster, frozen scallops, etc., were also harvested within New England waters. That was our qualification for being a local and regional food product. For fruits and vegetables, it was grown in Maine or New England and was raw, unprocessed fruit or vegetables, not including grains, grasses, nuts, seeds, or fruit or vegetable juices. So this gets complicated and was certainly an area that we talked about a lot as we were building out what questions our survey specifically asked, and required fine tuning as we went out throughout the process, because where we started was very specific, was extremely state focused, and we could not get the level of data that we wanted. It's either not being tracked, it wasn't being willing to, they weren't willing to share it with us. The mechanisms across different entities, as we know, all source or all track and report data differently. So we had to come up with what we felt was a comprehensive, inclusive list. But certainly this will have more focus and eyes on it as we develop the next count. It's complicated.
So fair to say that when this report references local, it's Maine or New England.
Correct.
I just put a link to the main report directly into the chat, so you guys can pull the PDF up that Leah's referencing. And this is also accessible through the other link that was added earlier, but this is a direct link to the report, so you guys can see it.
Thanks, Tanya. And want to make sure Susan gets her question in. Go for it, Susan.
Oh, thanks, Alita. Um, so I just had a question about, and I know I've been back and forth both with you, Leah, and Tanya as well, about data sets that have some specificity for both schools and for seafood. And I wondered if there's thought on the next local food count getting down to more of that specificity, and if there is what the plan is for doing this next time around.
We're going to get into that a little bit in the later slides. I'm just looking through what we had done. So we worked with Fine on this iteration of the project and had really robust outreach and feedback from K through 12 colleges and universities, especially, we know Sodexo serves a lot of them. Sodexo was very willing to work with us and talk to us about their purchasing and sales. And schools and colleges as well are featured in that expenditure series data. So we went sort of from a multi-pronged approach here, trying to understand what was already available, build that in, and then figure out what other material and what other data we needed to acquire. So I think that the K through 12 and colleges and universities offer an insight into how robust tracking and reporting could be. At other entities, I actually think it's probably one of the best entities that does it. And so it would be, as we go into our next count, hearing what's missing, hearing where the gaps are that you're seeing and wanting to better understand the data in your work, Susan, will be really informative and helpful so that we can help to understand that better, given the entities that we're reaching out to, the partners that we have. Because on the outset, you would think that was available, right? But clearly not all of it is.
Yeah, thank you. That's super helpful. And I think I also mentioned this too, like as part of our Full Plates, Full Potential grant. We're actually meeting with the Data Innovation Partnership, our project this afternoon to talk about what kind of data we can collect. So anything from that can feed into yours, we're more than happy to share it to highlight those specifics.
Right.
And then my other question, and this is probably obvious, but is there any tracking of the donated food that is locally sourced? I mean, I'm thinking obviously about our Fishermen Feeding Mainers program. And for some of that, there actually are purchase records because there's a budget built in for public funding to support it. But is that built in there and I just haven't seen it?
It is in here. It's under home production and donations.
Okay,
And
awesome.
again, yeah, I think it would be helpful for you to look at this look at the Maine local food count report itself and kind of dive into some of these tables and how it's reported at the federal level. I think and we did reach out to Good Shepherd and many of the other great organizations in Maine that are doing doing food assistance and assisting with donations. And I think we can even push further in the next count of understanding that by product category, which again was where we need to improve on for the next time.
Great. Well, thank you. You were super helpful at helping me to like break things out when I was pulling existing data sets. So I really appreciate it, as well as like the opportunity to provide some feedback on the next iteration. So thank
Great.
you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Do we want to move forward with a few more slides and then save room for a few more questions at the end?
Great.
Yeah, that sounds good. And I note that there's still at least one in the chat, so I want to make sure we get to that.
Yes.
Leah, do you want me to keep going, or do you want
to? Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So the slide that's up right now is looking at regional. So I guess I have a question here, which is, what is the regional local percentage? Which means, Leah, how do you define that, just since you're still in speaking mode?
So the regional percentage is an average based on the state percentages. That makes sense. So as you can see from this figure, you can see the breakout of each state. And, keep in mind, like, and this is sort of like what we did with the sizes of the pie charts. Like Massachusetts is massive. Like their total food spending is $54 billion. So 1.4 billion of that, 2.7%, is their local percentage that we have calculated. And obviously, as we were revealing the results of this count, we really had to temper our partners' expectations and our funders' expectations with how close we are to 30%. So just putting some real language out there, we recognize that some of the percentages that are here are likely undercounts. As we said, our survey was not super successful. We had a great research team that did a lot of robust outreach and engagement. We had a lot of partners on the other side in grocery and distribution, in state level businesses and organizations moving food. So we had a lot of engagement that we're really looking to build upon for the next count and garner that support for how much local we actually are moving. So just recognizing for a second that some of the percentages here are likely low. And one of the language that we use in the report is that, this was an inaugural regional food count that really illustrated the difficulties of attempting to gather comprehensive purchasing data from a representative sample through a bottom-up approach. I mean, we just tried to come at this from a lot of different angles, but there's ultimately a real difficulty in engaging private business entities and building trust for them to be willing to share their proprietary sales and purchasing information. So part of the reason we teamed up with Annie and Alita here is to really explain why this count is so important as the metric we're using to get to 30% and the tool we're using to measure that, and the role that we're hoping you can all play in increasing and informing the main percentage in the next count. I kind of read the slide a little bit, Tanya.
That's okay. And just to kind of, I know Catherine asked a question in the chat just about why Vermont is so successful, because that's a standout. And even though they have a smaller percentage of total regional food spend, the percentage of what they are spending locally is significantly higher than what the other states are showing. And one reason is, just as Leah mentioned, these estimates for the other states are really conservative because we didn't get the participation in the study yet. But I think the other reason from my perspective would just be that, Vermont's already done several of these studies, and they've had a very intentional state government level focus on policies and strategies that are supporting their food system. So I think that this is a great sort of reflection of the work that has happened in Vermont to successfully promote their local food businesses. Leah, would you agree with that or add
Yeah,
anything?
100%. Yes. There's real uniformity from the Department of Ag and Markets all the way through Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund, through Farm to Plate Management and Farm to Plate. And Annie Harlow, who's really led the process in Vermont, has built relationships with, particularly with distributors and grocers and restaurants where the majority of our food is being bought and eaten. So those are the three groups that, drawing from the NEFNI research, that we need to engage with for the next count. Because ultimately, while institutions and schools and some of the other places that provide food to large populations, the reality is that it's not the majority of where food is being bought and consumed. The majority is in restaurants, the majority is through grocers. So how do we crack those market channels and get more local and regional food into them? And how do we get those entities to work with us to share their data? That's really the big question.
While we're talking too about participation rates, I just want to do a quick shout out to Maine Food Producers and Grocers Association and the Independent Retailer Shared Services Cooperative, both of whom helped us and our researchers try to figure out how to connect more with retailers. Even though we had low response rate, I mean, they were trying to help us figure out best approaches to that. So I think that's something we can build on for the next study. So the next slide that Leah pulled up is looking at the number of major grocery store chains and small stores in Maine. And I think one of the takeaways from this is just the number of small independent stores that we have and how much of an opportunity these represent, both I think for getting data and for creating new market channels or bolstering market channels for locally produced foods. You can see here that Maine has about 400 grocery and superstores where majority of residents source food for at-home consumption. And nearly 68% of those stores are part of a grocery chain comprised of less than 10 stores or unaffiliated standalone entities. I think in terms of the independent stores, again, sort of an opportunity there to create markets for local and regional farmers, fishermen, and aquaculturalists, and these different local businesses that we have, because the smaller independents sometimes have more flexibility to work with those types of local businesses. And in terms of the food processing work group, having all of you help build connections for the next local food count study to those stores that are in your areas that might be interested in participating, helping people understand why this is important and why the whole movement towards this 2030 goal is good for those independent businesses as well. Leah, what would you add to this?
I think so. If you look at the regional report, which is another great way to frame this in the context of the other 5 states, you can see how impactful and how much of the market share grocery stores make up. And so, like Tanya said, we think that there's a real opportunity to engage more with the independent grocers and co-ops. And we know, Mark, I think Mark Sprackman was on the call, or I saw him come in and out, is, creating programs like the Buy Local program, which, offer a similar chance of competition that we see with some of the bigger brands and bigger presence of brands in like Whole Foods and some of the other larger grocery chains. We see him creating a model for that in the independent stores. So what other ways in which we can empower small to medium-sized businesses to compete? So if that's something that you're involved with or working on, I'd love to learn more about some of the avenues in which that is happening. But I think that this graph is really meant to show the scale to which grocery is a part of our food system, and really saying that in order to get more local and regional food to us, we need it to go through this one particular market channel more. Um, so we engage with Hannaford, we're engaging with Stop and Shop, we're engaging with some of the larger grocery chains in order to have those conversations and really open up the dialogue and talk about the challenges that exist on both ends of the spectrum for the farmers that want to get in and stay in, and the grocers on the other side who are, in charge of metrics and quantities and all that jazz. And there's some real finagling and honest conversations that need to be taking place in order to move more food, more local and regional food. So that's what the graph says to me. Do you want me to start talking about some of these challenges so we can get to more questions, Tanya?
I'm looking at the time and I know we've got a few more slides to go and I
Yeah.
think you guys are getting done at noon. I'm wondering if we should just launch into the questions. I know there's a couple slides that look at Vermont, but people can really dig into more on the website and maybe we can get to questions. Does that make sense?
And would you mind stop sharing your screen so that we can look at each other when we're chatting?
Yeah.
Thanks.
So I'm noticing some questions in the chat. I'm looking at, I think, Catherine, you had one earlier that we didn't get to, which was about whether we were able to track where Maine produced foods are going, whether they're going throughout New England primarily or being shipped out of New England, and whether the product shipped out of Maine is selling at better prices, basically. Leah, do you have any thoughts on how I think that's probably more detailed than we were getting into in this first study.
Yeah, I mean, if I go back to the graph that we had on food away from home and food at home, and the purple, if you remember, the purple bar was really small, um, and the gray bar was really large as to what the differences between the total number and then what regional and local spend is. And we focused on New England. We were not focused on what's leaving or what is being sold outside of New England. So, as we hone the next count, there may be some more digging around that we can do there, but we really went from the larger USDA data set, the food expenditure series data set, and worked backward to understand what's exactly happening in New England. I'm just reading through your question because it's layered. Product shipped out of Maine, selling at local Maine price. Yeah, we didn't get into that. That was way too complicated for the amount of time and money that we had to execute the first count. But as we found with our entity outreach, we were able to better understand the types of products that are being harvested or grown, harvested, fished, etc. within the state, even though we weren't capturing that exactly in the total reporting that we did. We still have a lot of data that we were able to get by building out our contact database and developing relationships across the different entities in the state. So that we certainly have some components of that, but we didn't focus on getting exact dollar values for some of the specifics that you are asking about.
Hopefully that answers that question. Also, Sarah from Tooties was asking about whether this was the first time the study was done and whether there's any historic data to use. And this is the first time the study was done outside of Vermont. And one of the intents is really to establish this baseline data that now we can use when we're looking in the next one's 26, and then I think another one's planned for 2031, so we can start to see trends. Leah, what would you add to that?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think we'll share the slide deck that can be sent out to the group afterward, but we did have a couple slides from Vermont that show you how the metrics change over time and how much progress they've made. They actually developed an objective as part of their state level food plan to have 25% of the food sourced from Vermont by 2030. And so you can see how their percentage started out from something similar of like a 3% to I think it's around 10% now. So you can see the change over time, and that's what we're hoping to be able to show is how we've been able to increase not from multiple angles, increase our percentage closer to that 30% by 2030. And that's the reason why we're doing two more counts in 2026 and 2031, as Tanya mentioned, looking at the prior year's purchasing data.
I just want to pipe in real quickly because we've had discussions about how, it's almost 2025, right? I got the year right. So there's 5 more years until that goal of 30% by 2030. So I would love to hear from either of you just to speak a little bit about what's been discussed about how, like, let's not just get discouraged, or do we, whatever it is.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that we really talked about a lot when we were releasing the report and meeting with the commissioners at NIASDA about how to, stay behind the 30 by 30 resilience goal, which they all signed on to when we released the NEFNI report in 2023. I mean, I think one major takeaway is that we recognize this is an undercount. I kind of said that in the beginning of, our survey results were really limited. If you look at the actual numbers from the main report, I think it's something like, let's see. I mean, the survey response was really low, which means that we need to have a really robust marketing and outreach campaign in 2025. And one of the really great things about going into the 2026 count is that I basically have a whole year to make sure that happens. Prior to that, I had just come into the position. We had probably 4 or 5 months to create our team. And then we really modeled the first count off of what Vermont has done at their highest level after learning for 10 years. And so for multiple reasons, the first count did not have all the success that it should have had with more planning and time and campaign outreach. So going into the next count, we have a whole year, 2025. We need to have real concrete conversations about what our outreach looks like, which audiences we need to be engaging, how we talk to those audiences and engage their support. I think, data is kind of a meh term, like it doesn't get me super excited, but I think if we can create some articulated messaging that really motivates people and helps them understand that it's a metric by means to the end. I think Ellen mentioned that at our partnership retreat. Then we can better frame it so that people understand why it's important, and then hopefully garner some more engagement across the food system entities that we need to participate more. So I totally understand the sort of like, oh, we're only at 3.4%, but reality is it's probably higher than that. And we have a really robust opportunity and engagement with our partners. And honestly, the new partnerships with the state department officials going into this next count, which were not fully in motion in the last count. And so using that state support, that nonprofit organizational support, and community level engagement, I think we have a better trifecta to make the 2026 count a lot more reflective of what's happening. So
Leah,
Quickly,
Bill has go ahead, Tanya.
just quickly note too, I mean, we've just had a lot of investments in local food systems. And I don't think we've seen what those are gonna bear for fruit. So I'm hopeful about that. Sorry, Bill has a question.
Yeah, question and comment. First of all, this is great stuff. And for the first time out, it's fantastic. I said in one of the postings I put up here that the faster we get to looking at this as a region, the better off we're all going to be. This one of the things we advise our. By the way, we try to get this information from our members who are here. We can't, or you have to go out and basically put them in a corner and force them to give you the data, not because they don't want to, just because it's not what they do. And I think a lot of the people you're asking for data from either don't collect it, or if they have it, it's not accessible and it's not that important to them in terms of their daily life. And so this makes it extremely difficult because in most cases, the most important data, when I look at this, is coming from those 5 or 6 or 700 smaller local markets, because that's where the action is going to be. It's not going to be Hannaford's. If you took all the production of all New England states and said it's all going to go to Hannaford's, it still wouldn't be enough to do much. The buyers that we're talking to are too big for the production that we can scale both at a state level and a New England level. And I think we have to be careful about setting expectations about what's reality, just in terms of what we actually produce, and versus what's consumed. And then when you look at those numbers, getting the 30%, I think, is going to be hard, realistically. The only thing that's working in our favor is that the push towards more local, and I'm hoping we start defining local as regional and not Maine boundaries, New Hampshire boundaries, Mass boundaries. Those aren't even practical for what we're talking about. And so I'm hoping this, I think for me, the major emphasis of this whole research project ought to be, at least for me, is making regional acceptable as a definition of how we think about food production, food manufacturing, processing and distribution, and consumption, and get away from thinking about it from the state standpoint. Because you have a strong region, you'll have strong states. If you don't, you won't have, it's just not going to work. So we've been stuck on the state stuff, I think, for too long. I'm very impatient. I think it's time to really focus on the region, but the states make up a part of that. But if we stick with seeing how well states are doing, we're not going to get very far because it's simply not going to work.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that, Bill. And as a regional partnership, we are constantly advocating for using the words regional consumption, New England. I think there's a lot of interests, state level interests that led us to having specific state reports, for example, state briefs, for example. And so it's sort of that building the building blocks to make that case.
You got to have those. You got to have those building blocks to make the case, and they are important in informing the state. But I think you're right. We tell our folks here, don't think about going national. Don't worry about how you define local. It's the region. If you can sell, it's a long way to Presque Isle from Portland. We have this fake boundary that defines us, and it puts everybody in a box, in an artificial box that just isn't realistic from how things work. And I think by reinforcing that and what you're doing in terms of reinforcing regional, at some point it will flip to that. It took a long time to get us to think about local. So this is now we're saying, yeah, but local is not what you thought it was. There is local, and then there's an expansion of that to make it work. And I think that's going to be the next hurdle, because once everybody thought that, okay, local meant from Maine or from New Hampshire or from Vermont, yeah, that's sort of true, but it also goes both ways in order to make it really work. We're not getting it from California. That's all. We're not getting it from Florida. We're not. And there are things that we can do here. And if you look at what we can grow, what we can raise, what we can harvest, that's the definition of what we can do.
Right.
We're not going to grow avocados, so don't worry about it. And I think if you look at what we have for an ecosystem, we can grow is what's going to generate what we can make and sell and distribute. That's going to be the defining piece, not the boundaries, because we're the growing ecosystem for the Northeast is pretty common. It's just how long your growing season or harvesting season is. That's the differential, but it's all pretty much all the same stuff.
Mm.
So I just want to say that within the next year, as this project is planning for the next local food counts, just to keep this in mind, keep like the relationships that you have in mind with folks that local food counts might want to connect with for the next one. And just an invitation, Leah, to tap back into the processing work group folks, and the relationships that we have for the next round.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Yeah. All right, it is past time. So if there's any other follow-up questions or thoughts, we will follow up with Leah's email, contact info, and feel free to reach out to her directly, right, Leah?
Yeah.